Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are in the world. You're very welcome in joining us today. My name is Brandon Hamber, and I'm the John Hume Chair in Peace at Ulster University. And my job is very brief today, just to welcome you to what is our fifth seminar in the Youth, Peace and Security Leadership Seminar Series. And importantly, today we're going to be discussing youth perspectives on climate, peace and security. The session will be chaired by Danica Damplo, who is the Youth, Peace and Security Program Manager at Interpeace. And I would just like to thank her in advance for her contribution to the seminar today. But before turning over to Danica, I just wanted to say a few words about our Youth, Peace and Security series. The aim of this series is to explore the positive contributions of young people to peace and to provide an online platform for young leaders to share their experiences from around the world. The series builds on the UN resolution 2250, which specifically highlighted the positive contribution of young people to peace, to try and move away from this idea of a deficit model. What is the problem with young people, rather looking at what actually are they doing in changing our world. The seminar series also builds on a follow-up report to that resolution commissioned by the UN Secretary General and authored by Graham Simpson, called The Missing Peace. The purpose of the seminar series is not to hear from people like myself, but to hear from young people directly, and that's who we'll be hearing from shortly. We also run this is a public seminar now, but prior to this event, we also had a private seminar with a number of the young leaders where they get the opportunity to explore issues among themselves. Finally, I just want to thank our partners, the John and Pat Hume Foundation, the Ulster University as well, who I'm from, but have also have a range of people working on this, particularly Liz McCardle, International Fund for Ireland, and of course, Interpeace. And a special thank you to Graham Simpson, who has really helped us connect a lot of people around the world through his work, and also Colette Cassidy from the Hume Foundation. So I just wanted to introduce you a little bit to the seminar series, give you a little bit of background. This is our fifth edition of the series, so I think we're building quite some momentum. Today we have nearly 200 people who've signed up for the seminar series. That's been the norm for all of the seminars, which in and of itself points to the contribution that many people are making around the world. So thank you once again, welcome once again, and I now hand you over to Danica, who will take the session from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for the warm welcome and for those remarks. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's truly a pleasure to have you all here, and it's a privilege to be chairing this panel today. We do have an update on the panel. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Nisreen Al-Saim, is unable to join us due to the internet being cut in where she is in Sudan, and our thoughts are with her and hoping that she stays safe, but she sends her best to us today. I do want to give you a few words from one of her remarks, because she's a phenomenal speaker and an expert and contributor to this space, and I don't want us to miss having some of her thoughts here today. And one of the phrase of hers, or the finding of hers that I'd like us to begin with, is where she talked about in one event how the term climate anxiety is misleading, that for much of the world, and particularly for the world's young people, it's a climate reality. And this is particularly true in her home country of Sudan. And the other thing that she has often emphasized is not just the link between climate and conflict, but the fact that the way in which climate affects the most vulnerable, and we will not truly tackle the effects of climate change unless we focus on those who are the most hard to reach, those who are the most vulnerable to its effects. And so for her, those have been things that she has emphasized in her work. And so we wish her all the best. And we start forward today with those very astute and wise words from her today, to focus on this as a climate reality and to look at the links between climate mitigation and peace building, and in particular, the youth leadership that she has inspired and encouraged. To introduce myself, I'm the Youth Peace and Security Program Manager at Interpeace. Interpeace has worked with young people for decades in both our country program work and in our policy work. We have long considered young people to be a critical constituency in making and building peace. And I think for this discussion today, we have a fantastic opportunity to look at both the youth contributions in recognizing and mitigating the effects of climate change and young people as leaders in the peace building space. We had a closed door session prior to this in which we discussed these issues. And one of the things that I've seen in the past, and I think we can discuss today, is that we don't often see them in context together, and the ways in which young people working on climate and young people working on peace building have many strategies and initiatives and things that they can share in their work together. So this is a fantastic opportunity, not just to dig deep into these areas, but to see how they connect and the linkages that young people themselves are making. And so it's truly a privilege to be part of this unique conversation. So without any further words from me, I'd like to start us off with our first speaker today, who we are very happy to have with us. And again, we'll have our speakers Rosalind and Anupah are here, and then we will have a bit of a fireside chat style discussion after they speak. And if you would like to contribute questions, please write them in the chat, and I will be sure to refer to them during the discussion and give them to our speakers. So our first speaker today is Rosalind Skillen. Rosalind is a climate activist currently studying her master's in environmental policy at University College Dublin. Alongside her postgraduate studies, Rosalind worked for the environmental charity Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, partnering with community groups to develop climate mitigation and adaptation plans. She has represented the views of young people at global climate change conferences, including COP26, and is a columnist at the Belfast Telegraph. She also looks at the connections between climate change and peace building. So Rosalind, without any further ado, I'd like to give you the floor. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danica, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. My name's Rosalind and I'm from Belfast. I'm a climate activist from Belfast, currently studying in Dublin, and I'm going to be sharing a local perspective on environmental peace building. But first, I want to start off by providing a definition of environmental peace building on the next slide. So the Environmental Peace Building Association was set up, and it's a really great online resource, which is actually really helpful if people want to dig a bit deeper into this topic. But they lay out environmental peace building as a definition. So environmental peace building integrates natural resource management and conflict prevention, resolution and recovery to build resilience in communities affected by conflict. And it's really great to start off with that, because in some ways environmental peace building is still quite conceptual and quite abstract, and what I'm going to be talking about is a bit more practical examples on the ground to really illustrate it. But really this idea that even when the political environment may not permit peaceful relations, the physical environment highlights common connections between people that are separate to their political identities. So it highlights what's shared on the opposite side of the divide, and this need really to look beyond our backyards. And in my view, I think that provides a springboard for technical collaboration and policy collaboration. And I think that environmental peace building is the essential lens through which we should address the climate crisis, because the climate emergency and the related nature and biodiversity crises are just so vast that in the context of Ireland, cross-collaboration is going to be imperative if we're to find a way out of this crisis. And cross-border collaboration is essential if we're going to build resilient, dynamic environmental policies and ecosystems. And I think the environment is inherently an all-island issue. It's a global issue. Seas bypass natural jurisdictions. Carbon emissions don't recognise borders. And many environmental issues are transboundary by nature. But on the next slide, I talk about what it means for environmental peace building in a post-conflict society, looking particularly at the context of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So where the natural environment can provide reasons for collaboration, as I've just outlined, Unfortunately, there's many examples of how nature can also divide communities. So in post-conflict societies, the scale and the cascading impacts of climate change can further complicate relations, making it more difficult to resolve issues and also increasing the likelihood of slipping back into cycles of conflict. So many people may be aware climate change is often framed as a conflict accelerator or a threat multiplier because the direct impacts of climate change can hold severe impacts on community disputes. And in Ireland, we've experienced similar tensions in historic and more recent times through the management of issues like cross-border waste crime, transboundary pollution, and also in the treatment of natural resources such as land and forests. So national resources are a cause for national concern. They pertain to all the citizens across Ireland, but they can create the conditions for a return to disagreement and conflict. But fortunately, on the next slide, I've got many examples of positive environmental peace building stories in Northern Ireland. So as Danica said, I work for an environmental charity. I work really closely in community gardens, community allotments and community farms, all sort of along peace lines in cross-border areas. And I see that food growing, horticulture, and just being together in open spaces is a way for people who typically wouldn't be together to come together and have like meaningful relationships. And I think as well, the creative and cultural sector is a really brilliant way to harness this. And they're showing quite a lead in terms of environmental peace building because they're widening participation, and schools and colleges, higher level education, Cooperation Ireland, the Education Authority, all these bodies as well, which are bringing people together through environmental peace building and environmental education, which I think is really, really brilliant to see in Northern Ireland. And then you've got as well typical peace building groups like Corrymeela Peace Building Centre, for example, who are also advancing the environmental peace building agenda. But on the next slide, I wanted to highlight a particular example because I mentioned the creative and cultural sector there, and it's something I feel quite strongly about. I do think that creativity, art and communication can really help us to advance the climate agenda. For those people who are maybe less familiar with Ireland and the political context here, but in the cityscape, there's so many murals, murals inscribed and installed on the city walls as a way of marking territory and as a way of sometimes communicating a political message. So last year, I worked with Friends of the Earth on this mural here and the fantastic mural artist Danny Simpson. And as you can see, it communicates an environmental message. So this idea that the environment is giving us common ground, literally common ground beneath our feet and common good. It's giving us reasons for agreement and accord rather than disagreement and discord. And it's uniting people around a message that's bigger than the political agenda. Well, obviously the environment is inherently political, but we all own one Earth, Mother Earth. And as you can see here, there's the pair of interconnecting hands, the bees and the biodiversity. And we got really positive reception around this because, again, it's just an example of showing how people can be tied to a collective goal and a wider objective that goes beyond them. And of course, because I study environmental policy, this is what I'm particularly interested in. And on the next slide, I've got some examples of how environmental peace building can really be incorporated into policy and, in my view, strengthen policy. As an environmental policy student, it seems obvious to highlight the need for both jurisdictions to work together on environmental issues, especially given that similar problems are faced on either side of the border. And without cohesive policy across Ireland, we will fail to effectively address a challenge like climate change, which knows no boundaries. The North and South have more in common than not, and it doesn't make much sense for two jurisdictions located literally side by side to be looking in opposing directions for policy recommendations, Belfast towards London, Dublin towards Brussels. And in my view, the best environmental policies across Ireland not only build resilience and promote inclusive, sustainable development, but they're the ones that are also strengthening community relations. One that I particularly want to highlight is the Cooperation Across Borders for Biodiversity, a peatland conservation project that was being led by the RSBP, and it was taking place in Northern Ireland, Ireland, and the west coast of Scotland. And what was really beautiful about that was that people were learning about each other's ecosystems, and it was a way of opening conversation, like social dialogue about cultural heritage, and also it helped to address obviously underlying tensions among communities that maybe shared the cross-border landscape. So again, these are really practical examples of just showing us how we can address environmental issues while promote peace and resolve any potential conflict. But going forward on the next slide, when we're looking at how the peace building conversation is going to progress, there are no clear outcomes and objectives for environmental peace building. I think that's one of the most beautiful things about it. It happens very organically. And I think that's because most people don't actually even realize that they are peace builders. In terms of what I've noticed, I think it's great for relationship building. It's great for contact linking and coalition building. And crucially, I think that Ireland is well placed to show leadership in this. It's the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement next year, and this is going to provide an opportunity for many people to progress or to reflect on progress that's been achieved across the island on a whole range of issues. And it will open up a space for a dialogue about what comes ahead, and crucially, what climate action will look like over the next 25 years across Ireland. So although there's no neat, singular, unified objective or agenda to environmental peace building, I really do think that this is the lens which will help us to formulate a unique perspective going forward, one that puts people, place, planet and peace at its centre. And I just want to end by showing you a really quick 1-minute video, which just gives you a flavour of the kind of projects that I've been working on. And yeah, the participants of some of the projects speak better than me. So if you could show the video, Alan, that would be brilliant.
This project that we're delivering with Glenbank was generously funded by the UK Community Renewal Fund, helping them to deliver a community-led climate action plan. So over the past few months we've been working closely with them to help them not only to elevate their ambition and to think of different ways that they want to use the money, but also how we can practically assist them on the ground. There's so many different benefits beyond the environmental impact. It's really enhanced community cohesion, social inclusion. We've seen a massive impact on the volunteers' health and well-being as well.
We call it our wee haven, or just a wee tranquility. It's a walled garden. We're off the Laganeel Road and you wouldn't know it. You think you're away in the countryside somewhere. And when you look at it from a wee seed and you get months down the lane, you actually say, I done that. It just lifts you, just lifts your spirit.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rosalind, for that amazing presentation and enthusiasm. It's really interesting to hear about. And I think what struck me also was so much environmental action that's related to peace building that I hear about is very reactive. You know, the need to better mediate resources and cooperation. And what you're talking about is very proactive and very organic and very collaborative. And I think that that's very positive. And I especially love all of the practical examples, which is something that we talked about in the previous session being so important to focus on actions, and especially actions that everyone can take and that build community, and rather than alienate, actually mobilize and unify people. So that was incredibly useful to hear about. So very much appreciate and looking forward to speaking with you further during the discussion for sure. Our next speaker is Anupah Makoond. Anupah is a data and program analyst at the UN Peacebuilding Fund. She is the author of Beneath the Waukesha Oil Spill, Exploring the Linkages Between Youth Marginalization, Environmental Disaster, and Resilience for Peace in a Small Island State, which was published on Interpeace's Outside the Box web portal. Until recently, she was a research manager for the Peace and Human Rights Data Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where she provided expertise in data collection and analysis to humanitarian agencies and peacekeeping operations across the world. Anupah previously led advocacy efforts for nonprofits working on social and health problems in her home country of Mauritius. Anupah studied international relations at the London School of Economics and New York University, and completed dual masters in business and in evidence-based social intervention and policy evaluation at the University of Oxford. Anupah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Danica, and thank you so much, Rosalind, for this great presentation. I'm actually going to speak on the other side of the coin. What happens when you don't take care of the environment, when you don't listen to young people? So I'm super lucky to come from one of the most peaceful countries in the world. So Mauritius is often given as an example of a country, one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that has had a track record of peace since its independence and has had pretty successful development. I've benefited from free education, free healthcare, and universal pension, as well as an independent press, as well as an independent judiciary. I've seen elections happen every 5 years growing up. So typically I'm used to a very peaceful country. 2 years ago, I came to Mauritius during COVID. There was a panic. A lot of people went home. I was one of them. We managed the pandemic quite well, but then a few months later, we had this boat that got stuck on the coral reef, and we could see it from the horizon for a few days, and everybody was wondering what's going on, what's going to happen. People were asking, is the government going to react? Is the government prepared? What happens if oil begins to spill out? And oil began to spill out. So there was oil in the sea. Things started to get really bad. There's been quite a lot of damage, especially in the south of the island, and the government was not prepared for it. The government took a long time to respond, and people got so angry. So Mauritius is not a place where people protest. As I was mentioning, we've done quite well. We have problems. I used to work with people who use drugs, and I've probably seen the worst of the island. But compared to a lot of places, we're extremely lucky. It's not a place where people protest. If they're mad at the government, they will vote them out in the next election. So we kind of have our own mechanism for accountability. We have a sort of social contract system that works. So what happened when you had the oil spill, people went out on the street in a way that I had never seen in my lifetime. My parents sort of alluded to protests that had happened in the late 60s and early 70s when people were demanding education. But even then, I think it was the biggest protest. So what made people so angry? Of course, seeing dead dolphins covered in oil will make us super angry. We're a small island nation. If our oceans are messed up, the future generations are over. So that was a big problem. So as a peace builder, I rarely get to study Mauritius. I rarely get to think about it. Unfortunately, peace building, we tend to mostly study the conflict affected countries. So I kind of use my peace building lens to kind of look a little bit beneath the oil spill. What was wrong? And actually, the thing that I started to uncover was that even though we had elections as the main mechanism to hold governments to account, this was sort of becoming perverted. Because of our changing demographic, we have an aging population. About 22% of the population is under 18 years old, and 2/3 of the population that votes is above 35. And so the sort of politicians, when they're setting their policies, they tend to prioritize policies that will get them elected by sort of pleasing the older constituency of the population. So as a data analyst, what I did, I started looking at budget expenditures, and I found that 1/4 of the national budget went to financing old age pension. Now, I have a grandmother who benefits from it. I know a lot of older people around me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but what I'm saying is that even though it's worked well for many years, the fact that the government was unable to find a way to sort of allow young people's voice to sort of influence policy, to help set priorities, but rather just sort of go towards just what would get them elected, that actually had a negative consequence on our ability to be prepared for an ecological, not a natural disaster, an ecological disaster such as this one. We could have invested more in social protection. The national budget expenditure on environmental protection is less than 1%. So I just looked at the numbers. So this was 2 years ago. Spending on old age pension has since increased by 20% more. Spending on the environmental protection has only increased by 8%, and it remains less than 1% of the national budget. So for me, as a sort of peace builder, the approach to this was beyond the natural disaster, that the unpreparedness for addressing the Wakasho oil spill created, the fact that the government or successive governments haven't found a way to allow the voices of young people to emerge in policy making. We do have a National Youth Council. It's not very active. I don't think we have anyone under the age of 30 in parliament. The statistics are not even available. And as I mentioned, the voting age is 18. So anybody under the age of 18 who will be more affected by sort of oil in the oceans and other environmental disaster doesn't get a say in what in the sort of policy prioritization of the government. And also younger people tend to vote less. People who live outside of the country cannot vote, which often happens to be younger people. So my sort of perspective on this is sort of more of a warning signal. We're a peaceful country, but if we are not allowing young people to participate in policy making and policy influencing, we risk not only undermining our ecology, our biodiversity, our oceans, we also risk missing out on an opportunity of sort of being a forward-thinking country, of being a country that can remain peaceful. I'm frankly worried. So the protests that happened were very peaceful. There was no violence. We're very lucky that a lot of so in addition to having a strong welfare state, we also have norms and traditions and institutions that do not tolerate violence. And I repeat, we're extremely lucky, but we can't take them for granted. I think it's really a warning signal that even the countries that are generally peaceful, if we marginalize young people, if we're not being able to prioritize the issues that matter to them and that will affect their future, we risk sort of breaking the social contract on which I think a lot of the country's resilience is founded. And we risk sort of missing out on opportunities. In the 60s and the 70s, when my parents were protesting, they were asking for free education. They were asking for the voting age to be lowered from 21 to 18. And I think having free education, free healthcare, which were demands made by young people in the 60s and 70s, is one of the things that allowed Mauritius to be so resilient over the years, both economically and politically and socially. So now if we're not updating and we're staying stuck in the same sort of pillars of peace that existed in the 60s, but we're not, for example, taking into consideration the environment. And it's amazing to hear, I just listened to the sort of this internal discussion with youth from Ireland. I'm like, wow, I want you guys to come over and help us set this up, to shake up young people, to also participate more, and to be able to sort of bring that to the fore, because I really do think that, so the sort of negative side of it is if you exclude young people, you risk sort of undermining the environment, you risk unraveling the social contract. But if you find a way to allow them to participate in society and policy making, you can become a more forward-thinking society. You can become a much more resilient society, a much more innovative society. So it's, as somebody who works on peace building and who always emphasizes prevention, I wish I could do more, or I should probably do more to make sure that young people have more voice in the country. And I think it has to work both ways. I think on the one hand, government needs to create space for young people to participate, but also I think there's a lot of learning, there is a culture of youth activism that doesn't necessarily exist in the country, possibly because of its historical trajectory, maybe because we had it too good. We didn't have to fight for anything, unlike our parents' generation who lived in much more poverty. So I do hope that we find sort of the strength and the inspiration and the imagination to be able to find ways for young people to participate more. And as a peace builder, and I think of this increasingly, I do think that the participation of young people, just like the participation of women in peace and in peacemaking and policies generally, will have a contribution to peace in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anupah, for those comments. And it was very useful to see the other side of the coin, as you said, when it comes to when young people are not being included and there's less of a focus on the ecological side of things from the government. And I think what I also reflected on as you were talking was how often young people's desire to how progress requires some shakeup, some change, some friction, and that can sometimes be used against young people. And I think there's a really interesting conversation about the importance of progress requiring that kind of conversation, even if they're difficult, but the challenge of that in spaces that are not accustomed or uncomfortable or concerned about that kind of movement or dynamism. So we now want to move into a bit of more of a fireside chat type conversation. So we want to pull in Anupah, Rosalind, and two of the young people from the prior conversation that we had, Emma and Elon. And I'd like to start by bringing you all in with us to the prior chat with some takeaways of my own. So essentially everyone came into this conversation with different perspectives on their own work. A lot of young people from Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, who work on different climate issues at the local level, at the global level, and coming at this from many different dimensions, were able to share their thoughts and their experiences. And I'll start with a takeaway from my end, and then I'll actually ask Anupah and Rosalind for their quick takeaways. So we'll basically update you on some of it. But one of my takeaways from our conversation is the conversation was very focused on climate, but a bit as Rosalind implied, there was an organic link with peace building in much of what the young people in the conversation were discussing. The conversation focused around the need to mobilize rather than alienate people if you actually want to generate change on climate. The conversation was around the need for more access for young people that's consistent and that is responsive to their needs when it comes to young people being engaged on climate. And this is something we work on as well with young people working in the peace building space. The importance of relationship building as being really critical in terms of having long-term transformative impact was quite interesting. And I think there was also, in terms of positive sides of it, an emphasis on the importance of imagination and innovation and trying to find solutions. And I think when it comes to climate, there's often a refrain that this is something new, that these are challenges that are unprecedented. And I think with conflict, you often get this, well, these are problems we've seen before, but can't seem to be solved. And in both cases, there's often a request for creative solutions, but then a marginalization of the young people who are trying to bring really innovative thoughts into the space. So I think there's a really interesting connection there between young people bringing innovative thoughts into the climate space and the same kind of push for more creative approaches when it comes to peace building. So we just saw a lot of connective tissue there, which was really interesting. And so Rosalind, given your presentation as looking at a sort of, and I was especially struck in your presentation by when you said that people wouldn't call themselves peace builders, but they're doing work that has this kind of inherent link, which I thought was very interesting. And we also see a lot of young people working at the community level would also not use a term that we kind of deify in the global space, but has varying value levels depending on where you work and in what context. So I'm quite interested in if you want to bring a reflection from that past session, and if you had any thoughts on that link based on our conversation.
Yeah, so I think it is interesting. In the last session, we talked a lot about communicating with people in a way that resonated with their value systems and meeting people where they're at. And through my work on the ground and with community groups, I found that a lot of it is not even framing it from an environmental perspective in the same way, like maybe peace organizations don't necessarily frame things as peace building inherently, but like the relationship with environmental peace building is one that's still being drawn out, and the people who are in the community gardens doing the planting, doing the growing, a lot of the time aren't there because of the environmental impact, because they want to increase biodiversity or reduce carbon. A lot of it is to do with social cohesion, health and well-being, like poor mental health, they've got a lot of time, or they want to upskill themselves. Like there's so many co-benefits. And I think that one of the ways that we engage more people in this agenda is one, by incorporating the creative and cultural sector, because that automatically widens an audience and reaches more people, but also not necessarily always having to link it to the environmental benefit. I think in some ways that's implicit, but I think there's so much social impact to be gained. And it's the same for environmental policy more broadly. But I think that's the really beautiful thing that environmental peace building draws out. It's like the environmental impact, which is so positive, and then the social impact, and the two marry together really well and create something really beautiful.
Fantastic, thank you. Anupah, it's sort of the same question. I mean, I thought what was interesting in your remarks where you said specifically, it's a shame we don't get to do peace building more on contexts that aren't in the middle of conflict. And I think that's a point I've often struggled with as well, that we start at the wrong point for beginning peace building. But so looking at this peace building environmental link, how do you see that, and what are your kind of reflections on that?
Yeah, so similarly, I think in Mauritius, we never use the word peace building. Nobody knows what it means, but we've been able to sustain peace for many years. So obviously we've been doing something. And I think that with the environment, I mean, as I was saying, when the government, we were seeing the ship, I mean, you could see it was massive. The ship was stuck on the reef. It was really the fishermen next to the village who were sort of saying, hey, do something, like this is going to spill, because we know, we can see what's happening, right? So, I mean, the environment is part of the community. We live in such a sort of anthropocentric world that we think that it's just about human relations, but it's also about our connection to the earth. It's about things we grow. I mean, Mauritius for a long time was sort of patterned around sugarcane growing, right? So the seasons work around that. Now with climate change, I mean, somebody told me the other day, I'm seeing mangoes in October. That doesn't make sense. So we kind of lose our balance if we are not in sync with the environment. And I think it has a massive impact in how society and human relationships are structured. So if we can't get that right, I think it's going to undermine the way we interact with each other. I think it's going to undermine peace. And so I think increasingly, like, we need to factor in. And I think it's not surprising, as Rosalind was saying, that it kind of comes quite organically, because when you're able to be in touch with the environment, it kind of becomes quite natural that, like, human relationships order themselves around it. And it doesn't have to be called peace building. It doesn't have to be funded through a project or something. Very often people do it quite organically. So, I mean, labels are important, but it's also important to sort of speak the language of the universe you're in. So I completely echo that, Rosalind.
And Emma, I'd like to turn it to you, because this was something you were referring to and something you were learning with when you were working directly with communities. So I'd like to turn it over to you for some of your thoughts.
Yeah, Anupah's point about how we see our anthropocentric worldview is something that I'm trying to sort of challenge with my project that I'm doing, sort of focusing on educating people more about, like, the soil microbiome, and sort of getting them to see that there's so many complex strains of life that inherently, in fact, like, affect us, and to learn to live in relation with not only our human selves, but to the animals that we see, to the microorganisms that we see, and how even ourselves, that we are, me as a person, all individual people are like this term called a hollow bind, which is, we are an organism that supports many other organisms, just the way the earth is a hollow bind. So every person is this interacting community of relations, and even if we don't know it. So it's just sort of getting people to be aware of, and sort of bring back that sort of conversation of, how do we connect with each other, and how do we want to connect with each other, and how do we want to love each other, and sort of move forward for the future. And I think it's a really powerful thing, because we get caught up in these academic words and peace building and this and that, but it's really just sort of coming back to the center of sort of being like, oh, isn't it really nice to be in space with each other sometimes? Isn't it nice to have dinner with each other? And sort of, I really want to build community again within the work that I do, and try not to focus on this sort of constructed conflict that media sort of wants to give us in terms of peace building, that oh, people don't want to talk, and it's like, people do. It's just, we need to meet each other, as Rosalind was saying, sort of where they're at. Yeah, and I'm really interested to sort of bring in more community with the human and the non-human in this world, so we can sort of move forward together. But yeah.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that Nisreen tried to communicate to the Security Council and trying to communicate to different bodies is the need to meet young people where they're at, in contexts where climate is having a serious impact, and where assumptions were made about the connection between climate and catalysts for conflict without discussing it with young people in particular, and how important it was to meet especially hard to reach young people before you start to develop any kind of strategy. And so I think that sort of stopping and pressing a bit of a reset button is a really valuable lesson for kind of all of us working in a policy space that demands solutions faster than we can understand the problem sometimes. And Elon, you talked earlier about trying to traverse some of these spaces where there is a difficulty connecting because of often this lack of access or this policy push and these kinds of spaces. So in connection with what we've been discussing in the importance of community building and connecting when it comes to both environmental advocacy and the kind of that contribution to what can be an asset toward peaceful relations. I mean, I'm just curious about your reflections or just reflections on Anupah and Rosalind's presentations.
Yeah, I think a lot of communities are under a lot of pressure increasingly with the cost of living crisis, a whole array of different issues that are presenting themselves to us right now. And I think it's quite a luxury for us, in a strange sense of the word, to be able to consider climate change as such a big problem, because it is, for us living in Ireland, we're not feeling the impacts of it right now as bad as other places are. So I think it is quite a luxury for us to be able to think about that, and not all communities have that luxury. For people who are under a lot of financial stress, different social issues, they are quite, their minds are quite taken up with the immediate stresses and the immediate pressures. So I think relating the climate issue to all of the other issues that we're having and showing just how pressing this issue is and how interlinked this issue is, I think is really important. I think by doing that within communities, you can really relate to people and you can really speak to them on a one-to-one level where they will understand you better. I think people really respond a lot better to people within their own communities rather than people that they see on the television telling them what to do all the time. Yeah, I think it's grassroots are the key to making a difference within the climate crisis.
And it's also in the peace building field, again, I just can't get over that if we just changed the word, it would be similar to other conversations I've had, which I think is fantastic and a really interesting aspect of this. So I want to bring it back a bit to the unique role of youth. I mean, not just because we happen to be, and I'm thrilled that I can continue to keep putting myself in this category, and the role of youth in this space. Won't be able to do it for too much longer, I think, but for now. So I do want to bring it back to the particular role of youth, also because young people have clearly been leaders when it comes to climate change, and for and have a recognized role in peace building. And we had a question, kind of reflecting on Anupah's reflections on the voting age in Mauritius and environment having an impact on young people's environmental activism, and whether she has a sense of whether lowering the voting age has impacted environmental policy better. And I think if anyone else wants to reflect on that, I think we could also expand that to say, when do you think we've talked about kind of more organic and informal avenues for environmental activism, but there are ultimately formal structures through which a lot of this policy is decided as well. So I think access to those formal processes, be it through voting, be it through access to political leadership, be it through access to different types of systems for young people, can be limited. So if anyone wants to comment on that, the access to formal pathways to policy, please feel free. But I'll start with Anupah because I think this is very much a reflection on the particular case that you presented of Mauritius.
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think if, in Mauritius, elections are the main mechanism by which we hold government accountable. We don't protest. As I said, when I saw the protest, it was a shock, not to me. And I was in the protest being shocked, along with 10,000 people being shocked that we were all protesting, just because we don't do that in Mauritius. And so the main mechanism is we vote out. We've had situations in Mauritius where we voted all 60 seats of parliament against the incumbent past government. When we get mad, we get mad. So it's usually been quite effective at voting, but obviously it depends from context to context. I mean, even in the Mauritian case, businesses have a huge influence on the government. They obviously don't vote, right? But they have a lot of leverage because the private sector is extremely structured in Mauritius. They get sort of structured negotiations with the government ahead of every budget, right? So they're able to influence a lot of the policies. We don't have that for youth, right? And so being able to find the mechanisms where you're able to exert influence, I think that's what matters. And I think it matters from context to context, and it also matters from time to time. I mean, right now I'm like, okay, if you lower the voting age, is that actually going to make a difference? What if young people don't want to go to the polls, right? Because maybe that will change over time. Are there other ways of exerting influence? And where is the onus? Is it on young people to create that space, or is it on governments to create that space? I think it comes down to sort of power relations, right? So if whoever has the most power, I think, has more of a responsibility and capacity to make the first step, which is why I think we need to put more pressure on the government to make more space for youth to participate in politics. And whether it's through lowering the voting age or through other mechanisms, I think something has to be done. But also, I think, I mean, young people and sort of activists, and I say this having been an activist, sometimes we can get bogged down in our ideologies and sort of may refuse to make alliances that make sense. I'll give you an example. In 2013, a friend of mine went on a hunger strike for about 30 days to stop the construction of a coal plant. 96%, I think it's 76 now, 76% of electricity in Mauritius still comes from fossil fuels. So it's dramatic. So we have all these coal plants. So he did the hunger strike and managed to get a lot of people around him. But nothing was done until we were able to create an alliance with the sugarcane companies who wanted to have the bagasse, so the byproduct of the sugarcane, to be used for electricity production. So it was only when the two of us, sort of more the grassroots, with those who had the influence, the sugar milling companies, were able to create an alliance that we were able to set up a National Energy Commission and prevent the construction of the coal plant. So sometimes you also have to find the right alliances and know how to navigate the politics, and that's hard sometimes. So I think there's a lot to be done, and it's very context specific.
Anyone else want to weigh in? And what kind of access would be helpful?
Yeah, I think it's something that I've been dealing with quite a lot in trying to develop the education program that I'm trying to do at the minute. Is who do I want to align myself with, and what is the politics behind trying to create those alliances? Because I come from a very my journey started with Extinction Rebellion, so mine was a very sort of bullish, sort of on the streets, active protest, and over the years I've lessened that to an extent, but my politics is still very radical, and I see that the institutions that we're still in uphold oppressive power structures so implicitly that they don't even realize what they're doing. Because for an example of that is, if we look at the term human rights anthropologically, it's quite an insidious sort of concept, because human rights sort of existed that we could, another party could give someone rights, that the right is not just an inherent birthright of just being alive, that communities could decide, well, you can have this right and you can have this right. And I feel like with the talk about lowering the voting age, we say to young people, you don't have the right to vote yet, because you haven't, your lived experience isn't greater than an older person's lived experience, when really a child's lived experience is so expansive and so abstract, because they're trying to learn the world, that, you know, if we really actually sort of give space for children to provide their musings, even if they are abstract and we can't really understand them, they sort of bring us back into the awe of existence, which I feel like is lost sometimes. Like, what keeps me going is really just finding beauty within nature, which is why I love working with younger children. It's, you know, they'll look at a leaf for the first time and just be in complete awe, or they'll go off and they'll be staring at a plant for like 10 minutes. They've no idea why, but it's just, they have a different way of existing, and it's sort of trying to, our political structures don't hold space for that, because everything has to be very intellectualized, and there's not a lot of feeling anymore within political spaces, but it's trying to find, people still hold power in those spaces, and sort of trying to find a way to work with them. And there was a climate psychologist, I forget her name, but she actively works and does seminars with fossil fuel companies about climate anxiety and climate awareness and the youth perspective. And someone on her Zoom was talking about how sometimes, you know, we are the bad guys. So there is even people, even like the big baddies that we think of as awful people, they do still feel terrible sometimes about what they're doing. And I think it's, you know, meeting people where they're at is like the term that keeps on coming up, but it's trying to find a form of dialogue that holds space for all of the pain that we feel, that's being exerted on all of us by the systems and the oppressive power structures that we feel. And it's just sort of trying to hold space with that within everything and move forward, so we can create new structures that liberate us all from the pain of the past, which has put us in the situation, the climate crisis that we're now in.
Thank you, Emma. I think, oh, Elon, did you?
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to quickly say, sort of what we were talking about in the private session before was that a lot of youth spaces and youth programs may need some form of standardization to sort of align them with each other worldwide, because otherwise, you know, just different equalities are going to rear their heads in certain programs. You know, richer nations can put more money behind them and gain more power. There's no sort of universal definition of youth, which causes its own problems. I think sometimes when you get into sort of big conferences like COP, etc., although you are a young person who has gotten a say in, you know, this very big place, is sometimes the spaces aren't youth friendly. And I think we need to be conscious that if we're, you know, putting youth into these spaces, we can't expect them to know all of the things about protocols, etc., that, you know, people who have worked in, you know, have had this as their career for years and years and years. We need to sort of, you know, provide them with the supports to be able to, you know, use their voice in the most powerful way that they can.
Well, and that's an excellent point, and we see that very much in terms of the peace building space, and we also discussed that in terms of financing in the previous session, and the challenge for young people, including those who are working and trying to come up with their own projects and accessing financing. And financing for projects, that so much donor structures are tailored to the donor, not to the recipient and the needs of young people. And there's a lot of challenges in getting funding for projects. And I think actually what we're discussing and what Emma and Elon and Anupah have all spoken about corresponds with a question that I'm seeing in the chat. To what extent do the panel see youth activism in climate justice and peace building as working through existing political structures versus working outside of those and demanding new political structures? So Emma, you alluded to an extent about the ways in which political structures are not designed for young people. And Elon, you also take the point about these, that even when young people are given access to political space, it's not, there haven't been efforts to affect that space, to make it responsive to them. And Anupah, you raised the point of power dynamics continuing to be an element no matter what the political system is. And if those power dynamics are not malleable or are not open to change, then you're coming up against the same issue. But I think when it comes to both climate justice and the issues of peace building, do you see as part of the climate action, climate work, to be young people looking for new governance structures or looking for new structures, or is most of the work very focused on community level? Where do you think it should go? Should it be in both spaces? I mean, young people are active in many different contexts, and as you say, there's no standardized approach. There's no one unified approach. But I think it's an interesting point, even as we say these existing political structures are not necessarily responsive for young people and weren't built for young people. Is it part, or should it be part of the climate justice effort to change these structures to make it more responsive to young people for both climate justice and different forms of peace building, or are young people looking for new kinds of platforms and structures to be the pathway for them to promote these kinds of policies? This is a big question that we don't have to resolve, but I'm just curious if people have thoughts on this. Rosalind, did you?
Very good.
Yeah, no, I think it is an interesting way. Just to pick up something really quickly what Ilan said, I totally agree. I think too often at the time we're so fixated on getting young people at the table that we actually haven't given them the skills, the resources and the tools to be effective at the table. And I think a lot of like UNFCCC negotiations, I just used an acronym like myself, that's bad. But like a lot of the time it is acronyms, abbreviations, like all these buzzwords. And we just expect people to pick them up. And it's just, yeah, it's frankly so unfair. And that's not like depreciating the role of young people at all. I think obviously like incredible forces for change, but equally you need to like give people a broader understanding of political systems and how these structures work. So yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Ilan. But then to the second point, I just often think that obviously we do need to dismantle the system that we're in, and like climate justice is a massive part of that. But I am personally of the view that we need like all the strategies and all the tactics. And sometimes I actually don't really think it's that useful to focus on what's right and what's wrong, but actually just to celebrate the fact that people are creating change in different ways. And I think if we turn too much our attention on how people are getting across their message, obviously it should be in a way that's like peaceful and like collaborative and stuff, but in general it should be much more about what the message is. And I saw that very much last week with a lot of the media critiques of Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain and all these forms of protest. And people can have whatever view they want on civil disobedience and direct action, but a lot of the time I think the conversation centers too much on how they're doing what they're doing rather than like what is the message behind it. And I think it sometimes weakens it, which is a real shame. So I think to answer the question, that all forms of activism and coalition building are really valuable, and I think getting people to involve themselves in this subject and engage in whatever capacity they can with in the situation they're in, with the time that they have and with the privilege they hold, then I think that's a massive step forward. And we want to kind of eliminate as many barriers of entry as possible.
Great, thank you. I think Ilan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would completely agree with everything that Rosalind just said. I think both have their merits. Grassroots programs and organizations understand needs of communities and understand the people in communities and the specific problems that communities have in relation to these issues. Whereas, you know, if we move up into different structures, there has been great progress made in terms of youth councils, etc. Like the European Youth Forum does brilliant work and connects different youth councils all over Europe. And they obviously have a much wider audience, and I think that they get a lot more funding than, you know, a lot of different grassroots organizations. So I think a balance between the both, and I think both work very well with each other and they're very supportive of each other. So I don't think one is better than the other or one is more useful than the other. I think that they both have different merits that are both very useful.
I think that's an excellent point. And go ahead, Anupah.
Yeah, I'm going to put like my peace building hat on. So one of the first things you learn when you study peace building is that conflict is normal, right? And it can actually be a vehicle for constructive change. What you want to avoid is violent conflict. You don't want a situation where an amazing speaker can't come because there's tear gas and shelling where she is, right? So what you don't want is the violence. But conflict is really just different points of view coming together and clashing. And if you're able to create the space for something to come out of it, whether it's like through protests, whether it's through sit-ins, whether it's through writing petitions, whether it's through discussing at a table in a very polite manner, like whatever way you do it, if you're able to express dissent, right, that's not a bad thing, right? And I think what's happening is that young people, and I think like a lot of the things that I saw in Mauritius was like, why is it that we're spending so much on the older people? Not that that's, again, it's not a bad thing. Like, I'm not saying the bad people need to go away. I'm just saying there's a problem here. Like, let's find a way to resolve it, right? before things get really bad, before like we have to go to violence and lose our sort of stability or something like that. So I think completely in agreement with what everyone says, like we have to be able to see this as an opportunity. We have to be able to make I mean, young people are like shouting or making noise. They're like listen to us. We have a different perspective. Let's find a way to accommodate it. So I don't think that it's about, I think in some places it will be about reversing the existing political structures. In other places, it might be adapting them. In some places, it might just be, you know, small tweaks. So I think it's just, yeah, I don't think it's about what's right or what's wrong. I think it's about how can we move forward.
And I think that's a great point and actually connects with, we got a fantastic, we got a comment from Nisreen, the speaker who is unable to join because of unrest, and it aligns with where our conversation has just gone. Nisreen extended her thanks for our support she expressed before we started for her. And she said that for her, climate action is about preventing violent conflict from happening in the first place. And without good governance, there is no climate governance. And countries with political instability suffer the most. So I think it offers also another way to think about our conversation, because I think our conversation has been very geared with climate as the focus, or climate action as the focus. And Nisreen's point as well is actually peace building as, you know, an orientation isn't peace building the goal. And also good governance focuses on good governance can then lead to better systems that are more responsive to climate change, or at the very least, you're not going to have any policies on climate if you have violent conflict. And there was a good point made actually that I was thinking about while Rosalind was speaking in another event I was in, where someone made the point about how much do violent conflicts affect the environment, how much environmental degradation is there with conflicts. And Emma made the point about the transgenerational trauma that can not only contribute to the reoccurrence of violent conflict, but environmental degradation and all of these issues. So I think Nisreen brings an important point to kind of bring us back to the importance of governance, and also back to Anupah's point about young people being politically involved. And so I think it brings this question of governance back in and kind of challenges us a little bit on the focus on can we focus on environmental policy, all of the different ways of it, without making sure there's good governance, making sure that those structures are making sure that there are peaceful systems. Can we focus on one without ensuring the other? And so I think that was a good point to bring into this. And I think please feel free to reflect on that, but I do want to bring in the last question, because I think it's something that Liz and I discussed as well, because we noticed that all of the participants of our sessions are women, both in the closed door session and this panel. And one of our audience members asked, how can we get more young men engaged in climate and environmental action? And so I'm keen to hear your reflections either on the comment on good governance and also on this gender question. Is there a gender dynamic here that we should be discussing? And if so, how do we get more young men engaged in climate? What have you seen in your work specifically when it comes to gender and climate action? And this can be our last question to kind of sink our teeth into.
I have an observation, and then maybe someone else could build on it. But I think it's funny, because what strikes me anytime that I'm in environmental spaces, particularly in the policy space, is that it's often, Glasgow was in COP26 in Glasgow last year, the climate change conference was described a bit as a tale of two cities, in the sense there was the inside negotiations and the outside where activism was happening, these two separate spaces. What was really interesting was that at the inside, it was all older men in suits, and the outside was all female climate activists. So I think that there are men engaged in climate, but it's much more in the top down, and women are a lot more in the grassroots. And I really noticed that in the work that I do. And all my friends who are climate activists are all female, but when I enter a policy space, I'm one of the only women there. So I think it's a really interesting question, because it shows you about a bit about power, a bit about the different spaces that people engage in. So yeah, it's hard. I don't like to make any generalizations, obviously. This is just like my own observations, but it would be interesting to see if anyone else had any reflections on this.
Yeah, it's the role masculinity plays within how we interact with the world is something that I think about quite a lot. And gender, as a queer person, like, I identify as a woman, but I'm ultimately always questioning how gender affects how I exist within the world and how I'm seen and how other people see me and how other people interact with me. But definitely Rosalind's point about how it's usually men in higher positions of power, and that it's usually the women that are in more caring positions, and sort of even coming back to the point that people aren't given the skills to communicate. It's people aren't given the skills to critically evaluate how culture and how identities have formed within our culture. Because in school you get taught history and you get taught all this, but you get taught it as fact. You don't really get space to have those cultural analysis of how they've actually affected how we've interacted with the world. And there's an amazing writer called Sophie Strand who's currently trying to not dismantle masculinity, but she herself, she was saying how she was creating spaces for women who suffered violence, and she was saying how nothing was actually sort of progressing because she was only inviting women and non-binary people into the space. And she was saying that, you know, to actually really radically change things, she started welcoming men into the space to hold space for both of them, and to sort of get comfortable with that conflict again, and sort of allow us to create a new culture together while critiquing how our old culture has affected us. And definitely, like, yeah, we need more masculine figures and more male figures. And masculine and feminine, they're not identities, they're fluxing qualities that everyone has within them. And it's just sort of bringing back a space where we can talk about the effects of how that's affected, you know, climate action and peace building altogether. It's, yeah, just opening a space for dialogue again.
Fantastic. And I think it sounds like there's also room for, as we've seen climate connect, the climate justice, and ultimately showing us other links to peace building spaces. We also see it is a lens through which to look at gender dynamics and power dynamics more as well. And people are adding some thoughts in the chat too, if people want to check it out. When it comes to working with young men. Go ahead, Rosalind.
Sorry, Danica, I just had a thought as well. Like, again, some of the most brilliant climate ambassadors I work with are the men in men's sheds. So I've just seen that comment there from Politics in Action. But obviously these are older men, so over 60, but a lot of the time it's getting them to do woodwork or building or things that maybe they're a bit more interested in. And again, it's just like angling it in a different way. Like, what kind of environmental projects would you like to do? And then it's the idea of like community cohesion, and they're doing it all with other men. And I think, having spoken to them a lot when we were doing the climate action plans, it was kind of, they wanted something to do and they wanted an activity, whereas a lot of the women are happy to go to a community garden, do a little bit and then like chat. And so I think it's just different, and maybe diversifying the range of projects or widening participation in that way. But again, that's a reflection on older men, not necessarily younger men in the climate movement.
Thanks so much. I'm also I'm going to start describing when I fix like cabinets in my house as environmental action, because that will make me feel so much better about households, everything. But no, I think that's fantastic. And I really like that we've come back again to connect to people where they are in order to help them become part of a movement and help build consensus, which is so relevant to both peace building and climate justice. So I did want to thank you all so much for your participation before I hand the mic over, and just thank our speakers again, and to give our final thoughts to Nazreen, who is unable to join due to the government shutting down the internet. And I think that also says something to our conversation about access and power and a lot of the discussion we've had today. So we're very glad to have gotten at least some of her insights into the conversation, and we wish her all the best. I would now like to give the floor for the final closing thoughts to Dr. Seán Farren, who's the chair of the John and Pat Hume Foundation. Dr. Farren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Danica. Sadly, our conversation has to be suspended now because we're running out of time. I say suspended and not ended, because this is the conversation that has got to continue. There's so many key issues have been raised in the course of the last hour and a quarter. that we have to ensure that the conversation does continue. And I'm very pleased as chair of the John and Pat Hume Foundation, one of the co-sponsors for today's event, that we have been able to sponsor today's discussion. John and Pat Hume are well-known names in Northern Ireland and across Ireland and the UK. John was one of the leading politicians campaigning for peace throughout our long period of troubles. And his efforts have been widely recognized. In fact, he is in receipt of the Nobel Prize, the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Award, and the Martin Luther King Award. So that's a universal recognition that few people could achieve as he did. But I want to thank all our participants and those who contributed in whatever way to making this afternoon's event a success. I want to thank our three speakers who were present: Anupah, Rosalind, and yourself, Danica, in the chair. Sorry that Nasreen hasn't been able to join us for the event. But our thanks are also due to the International Fund for Ireland for their support, Ulster University through the Institute for Conflict Studies, and through the work of the Centre for Youth Research and Dialogue. I want to thank Professor Brandon Hamber, who holds the John Hume and Thomas P. O'Neill Chair of Peace at the University of Ulster. My thanks also to Tim Atwood, the Chief Executive cum Secretary of the John and Pat Hume Foundation, for his untiring work, and along with him, our project officer, Colette Cassidy. And I thank all of those who have joined in, wherever you are across the globe. I hope that we can soon unsuspend this conversation, continue to refine the issues, and ensure that the young person's voice is firmly and clearly heard in those channels of decision making where they have to be present, along with all of the other interests. And thank you all very much. And with that, I bring our event to a close.